Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's working session on investment facilitation for development. On behalf of the Friend of Investment Facilitation for Development, or FIFD, a group of 18 developing countries who are proponents of this joint statement initiative, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists and guests today. In this working session, we will explore the role of the future WTO agreement on investment facilitation for development in fostering post-COVID recovery and sustainable development. We will also update participants on the state of play of the investment facilitation for development negotiations in the run-up to MC12. The COVID-19 outbreak has acted as a supply, demand, and a policy shock for global foreign direct investment, which is a key source of income for developing countries and least developed countries. According to UNCTAD 2021 World Investment Report, global FDI fell by 35% in 2020. Furthermore, greenfield investments, which are crucial to foster economy's productive capacity and infrastructure development, dropped by 46% worldwide. Looking forward, FDI flows are expected to remain weak due to uncertainty over the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic. Foreign direct investment is an important part of the response to the pandemic, not least for the provision of the healthcare goods and services, but also for supporting economic recovery, helping to restore global value chains and enhancing export capacity beyond the crisis. In this context, a transparent, efficient, and predictable investment environment is essential to attract sustained and sustainable FDI inflows. Against this backdrop, the COVID-19 pandemic has pointed out to the importance of international cooperation, including at the WTO, for fostering economic recovery from the crisis. By firmly supporting the WTO in playing a leading and coordinating role during the crisis, we also reaffirm WTO's relevance in the post-COVID global economic recovery. Investment facilitation for development is one of the joint statement initiatives in WTO that can contribute to post-COVID recovery, particularly in the development world, which has been hardest hit by the crisis. A WTO agreement on investment facilitation for development can support countries' efforts aimed at putting in place investment facilitation reforms with the aim of attracting FDI for sustainable development. The initiative on investment facilitation for development in the WTO has progressed steadily, from the informal dialogue in 2006 to the launch of the structured discussions following MC11 in 2017, up to the start of formal IFD negotiations in September 2020. And in 2021, we reached a new stage by pursuing negotiation on the basis of a single negotiating text. The negotiations have indeed accelerated in the wake of the circulation of the consolidated document by the coordinator, the so-called East text, and subsequently the revised East text by the coordinator this year. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude, and appreciation to my dear friend, Ambassador Matthias Frank, the coordinator of the negotiations on investment facilitation for development in the WTO, and his wise and dedicated leadership. Significant progress has been made in advancing the IFD negotiations. It's crucial to continue working together and maintain this good momentum. I believe that we can certainly achieve a concrete, substantial outcome by MC12. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past decades, China has made great efforts and achieved substantive progress in investment facilitation to improve its investment environment. As stated in UNCTAD's report in 2020, the Chinese government's targeted investment facilitation programs helped stabilize investment flow after the early lockdown. China firmly believes that a multilateral framework would complement and reinforce members' domestic efforts to facilitate investment. With concerted efforts of all parties to promote a more transparent, predictable, and efficient investment environment to promote sustainable development, I believe the IFD agreement would lay down a solid groundwork for global FDI inflows, restoration, and post-COVID recovery. Now, I would like to introduce our 4 distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is Ambassador Matthias Frank, coordinator of the structured discussions on investment facilitation for development in the WTO and a permanent representative of Chile to the WTO, who will update us on the state of play of the negotiations. Our second panelist is Ambassador Lasami Kamani, permanent representative of the Republic of Laos PDR to the WTO, who will share with us the perspective of the least developed countries in the IFD negotiations. Our third panelist is Mr. Marcus Steele, president of both Africa. Mr. Steele will provide us with the private sector's perspective. And our fourth and last panelist is Mr. Ernie James, Senior Trade Officer, Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Customer Affairs of Grenada, who will share his country's views on the future IFD agreement and its role in developing countries. After all panelists have spoken, we would be pleased to answer questions from the audience. So please post your questions on the chat box. Let's start with Ambassador Frank. The negotiations towards an agreement on investment facilitation in the WTO have made steady progress. Participants have on several occasions reiterated the aim of achieving a concrete outcome at MC12. Ambassador Frank, please tell us, how do you see the progress advancing so far, and what are the next steps in the remaining 2 months up to MC12? Please.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee, and good morning to everybody. Thank you and the friends for organizing this event, this workshop. Also, thank you for your kind words and particularly for China's active engagement on this important negotiation, not only to push for progress, but also to bring more new participants on board. To answer your questions, I would like to go back to the 2017-2019 joint ministerials, Buenos Aires and Shanghai, and see what ministers instructed participants to do and how much the current 105 participants have accomplished in the year or so since negotiations started. I would say quite a lot. Let me add that. So first, minister asked participants to identify and develop the elements of a framework to improve the transparency and predictability of investment measures. In that regard, section 2 of the Eastern text that you mentioned, Ambassador, on transparency of investment measure is almost clean, with provisions on publication and availability of information and measures, information to be made publicly available if an authorization is required for an investment, single information portal, and publication in advance, an opportunity to comment on proposed measures, among others. Furthermore, participants started to discuss a text presented by the facilitator, our colleague Deborah from Guatemala, on information to be made publicly available on the entry and temporary stay conditions for business persons for investment purposes, a very important issue for many developing countries, but also delicate issues for others. Ministers also stressed the need to streamline and speed up administrative procedures and requirements. In that regard, Section 3 of the ISER text deals with issues such as reasonable, objective, and impartial administration of measures, authorization procedures, as well as procedural aspects, authorization fees, multiple application, use of ICT and e-government tools, independence of competent authorities, and appeal or review. This section is also very advanced. According to the Joint Ministerial Declaration, the agreement should enhance international cooperation, information sharing, and exchange of best practices. Text on those issues is well advanced too, with the creation of contact points, inquiry points, and a future committee on investment facilitation, as well as areas for cooperation among members and issues that could fall under the committee, including a work program with additional measures to further facilitate investment that have been proposed and discussed, but are not ripe enough to be included in the future agreement. Another important issue highlighted by the minister was the need to clarify the framework's relationship and interaction with existing WTO provisions and with current investment commitments among members. It is being addressed in a couple of what has been called firewall provisions. In addition, after long discussions at a small group facilitated by our Colombian colleague Manuel, participants agreed in principle on text languages for the scope and general principles section, as well as on a convergent text to exclude the creation of market access rights, investment protection, and investor state dispute settlement, as was clearly stated in the ministerial statements. Last but not least, ministers agreed that in order to facilitate greater developing and least developing members' participation in global investment flows, a core objective of the framework as so reflected in the preamble and the objective of the future agreement, their requirements in implementing the multilateral framework shall be assessed so that technical assistance and capacity building can be made available to address them. Participants agree that special differential treatment will be a key and integral part of the agreement, and more time has been devoted to discuss the TFA model in our meetings, as well as proposals from members, from which I should mention the contribution from Dominica and Grenada, Cambodia, and Laos. So thank you very much, Ambassador Kiomani, for your participation on these discussions, which have reinvigorated our conversations in the group. Although there's still work to be done, there's a general understanding on some general principles, among them especially difficulty experienced by developing at least developed country members in formulating and implementing measures and obligations will have to be taken into consideration. The extent and timing of implementation of the provision shall be related to the implementation capacities of the respective developing country, and such implementation will not be required where the member lacks the necessary capacity to do so. The group has also organized dedicated sessions with relevant international fora on this field, such as UNCTAD, ITC, the World Bank, OECD, the WEF, and the Inter-American Development Bank, who will be instrumental in the implementation phase as envisaged by ministers as well. Finally, participants share the understanding that for investment to really help countries to develop in a sustainable way, it has to be sustainable as well. In that sense, participants agree with the notion that foreign investors should abide by certain international recognized principles, standards, and guidelines on responsible business conduct. Hence, there's a role for members to encourage companies to incorporate those principles into the business practices and internal policies. In addition, participants also recognize the importance of members adopting measures to prevent and combat corruption. In both cases, there's a strong view that those provisions shouldn't be subject to dispute settlement. So members have done the job. Congratulations to them. Participants are committed to have a strong outcome by MC12 in the way of an as clean as possible text so many ministers can take note of the progress or even maybe endorse the work already done and give political guidance for the last part of the process that I guess shouldn't take so much time to finalize. On the challenges ahead, Chang'an, I would mention to finalize the formulation and disciplines on special differential treatment and fine-tune some provisions that are still being discussed, not necessarily on substance, but on how to formulate them so they address the views of all members. Additionally, the important question of how to incorporate the final agreement into WTO architecture is still to be solved. Clearly an issue of a more political nature that goes probably beyond our discussions. Nevertheless, the group had a chance to have an academic discussion on this topic, and we'll have a preliminary discussion next week. we also need to maintain our outreach efforts. And once again, thank you for leading the FIFID and the outreach efforts by the group, so we can convince those members who haven't joined the initiative yet of the benefits of the future agreement. Last but not least, it is always important to remind ourselves that ministers make clear that we are aiming to develop a multilateral framework on investment facilitation for development. Hence, the discussions have and will continue to be transparent, inclusive, and open to all WTO members, including all documents that are produced. In addition, the annotated agenda for each meeting, as well as a summary of the proceedings, are always made public. With that, Chingang, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you for your introduction and insightful views. I'm sure under your leadership, well, finally, we will reach our goal. Thank you. Now, I would like to return to Ambassador Lasami Kamani. LAPE PDR has been taking steps to enhancing its business environment. LAPE PDR has recently submitted proposals aimed at increasing the development impact of the future IFD agreement. Ambassador, please could you share your country's views on how investment facilitation can help developing and particularly least developed country members attracting sustainable investment, especially critical given the COVID-19 pandemic? Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee, moderator, for the opportunity. Excellencies, colleagues, I commend China's submission to WTO and WTO Secretariat for having this forum convened in an opportune time as we're gearing up the preparation for the MC12. I commend the excellent, I would say excellent progress made in the negotiation of the Easter text of investment facilitation for development. Allow me, moderator, to address the two improvised questions in three main points as follows. First, I will give a background on challenges and difficulties faced by the LAPE PDR is an LDC, LNDC, coupled with a wreak havoc brought by both COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, global warming. And the second point, to share the priorities embarked by the LAPE PDR's government to tackle the set challenges and difficulties. And finally, the third point, and focus on the general views of the LAPE PDR in terms of the investment facilitation and also the specific proposals or inputs of the LAPE PDR into the Easter text of the WTO agreement on investment facilitation for development. Mr. Moderator, is a LDC and LLDC, the LAPE PDR faces daunting challenges. You name it: subsistence, commodity-based economy, poverty, insufficient infrastructure, lack of qualified human capital and skilled labor, digital divide, high transportation and transit costs, issues related to red tapes and paperwork along the cross-border checkpoint, and so on. COVID-19 pandemic coupled with climate change have brought even substantive impacts on economy and livelihood of the people, including disruption of supply chain, connectivity, unemployment, loss of life and property caused by natural disasters, and so on. Currently, the LAPE PDR faces a local transmission of COVID-19 with a daily new recorded infections of 500 to 600 cases. As a result, we have currently imposed a total lockdown in major cities, including our capital, Vientiane, Thanks to both bilateral and multilateral donors and the COVID-19 vaccines assistance scheme, including the assistance from Chinese government and COVAX facility up to date, the LAPIDIA is able to have 44% of our population fully vaccinated. And we target to have 50% of our population to be fully vaccinated by the end of this year. On the way forward to contain the COVID-19, the LAPIDIA is concerned about the assurance and guarantee of having an equitable and affordable access to COVID-19 vaccine for all, including developing and least developed countries. We hope that the TRIPS negotiation on COVID-19 vaccine will be concluded by MC12. To turn the said already challenges and difficulties to opportunity, the LAPDR has been embarking its 9 5-year social economic development plan 2021-2025, which contain some priorities, activities and development, such as turning the country from a landlocked to a landlink, developing clean, green, and sustainable industry, focusing on quality, internationally accepted standard programs, including hydropower projects, diversified economy to create more jobs, turning transport corridors into full-fledged economic corridors, including East-West Economic Corridor, linking Thailand in the west and Vietnam and China in the east, and the trade and investment activities along Laos-China high-speed railway project, digital transformation, innovation, and startups by harnessing ICT to leverage the productivity and competitiveness of our MSMEs to be able to do e-commerce, among others. Now let me turn to the point number 3. That's my actually my main point of this presentation, that the general views of the LAPDR on investment facilitation and the specific inputs of the LAPDR into the draft ISTA text. I would like to offer 2 generic views of the LAPDR on investment facilitation. First, we believe that investment decisions are based on many factors: size of internal markets, infrastructure, location, availability of labor, and their qualification, the predictability and stability of the framework conditions, as well as the investment-friendly environment. And second, the LAPDR is a LDC and LNDC has unfortunately some deficiency in those fields. It is working very hard to overcome some of the bottlenecks. However, this takes time. Investment facilitation measures that improve the business climate is one measure we can take immediately. We want to make sure that investors have confidence that investment procedures in our country are transparent, predictable, and will be applied fairly. Our ranking in the ease of doing business report of the World Bank has shown that we have still a lot of work to reform our investment policies. This is why our Prime Minister decree has requested all ministries to propose concrete measures on how to facilitate investment procedures. This is why LAPDR is taking an active role at WTO negotiations by proposing food security measures, inputs into the negotiation of investment facilitation for development, MSMEs, and why we have adopted an e-commerce strategy and are going to accede to Information Technology Agreement, or ITA 1 and 2, during the forthcoming MC12. Let me turn to the specific inputs of the LAPDR to the ISTA text. 3 specific inputs. First, the LAPDR objective is not to maximize the amount of investment, but its quality. That is its contribution to value added, the available know-how, and its role in the sustainable and inclusive development, building on the availability of our natural resources in our country. Therefore, clear guidelines and conditions are required to ensure that the investment are in line with sustainable development objectives. It is important that such guidelines are implemented in a transparent and predictable way. Second, we are of the view that the investment facilitation measures which directly contribute to the socio-economic development of the host countries could include transparency, streamlining, simplifying, and taking shorter time of FDI's administrative procedures, supplier development programs, and domestic supplier databases to increase the capacity of domestic suppliers to contract with foreign investors. I think that already highlighted by the coordinator, Ambassador of Chile. The designation of a responsible business conduct coordinator to facilitate investor relations with local communities and stakeholders, the assessment of the potential development impacts of large FDI projects to ensure that they align with host countries' development goals and priorities, sustainable FDI projects through partnership with investment authorities in host and home economies. And finally, our specific inputs, we are aware that many of the measures contained in the draft Easter text are very capacity demanding exercise to implement them. Therefore, specific and needed specific and special and differential treatment, the flexibility to that needed technical assistance and capacity building in this regard should be considered and extended to developing and least developed countries, including the provision of special and differential treatment, the flexibility of self-designate pace of the implementation of certain obligations, and allowing a smooth transition period to implement them. In addition, these technical and capacity building assistance should be extended both during the negotiation and also the implementation phases of the agreement. To conclude, Mr. Moderator, the LAPE is of the view that synergy and complementarity between the WTO LAPE initiatives of the possible outcomes of the MC12 and other frameworks, plan of actions, and programs such as UNCTAD 15, ITC, LNDC, Vienna Plan of Action, and also the LDC 5, Doha Plan of Action 2022-2030, and others can help the LAPDR smooth graduation from the least developed status in 2026. Finally, I wish MC12 a great success. I thank you, Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador Kameni. Thank you for sharing your general view and specific thinking on investment issues. Our next panelist is Mr. Marcus Steele, who will provide us with the investor's perspective. Mr. Steele, please, could you tell us what are investors' key investment facilitation priorities and needs, and how the private sector could contribute to IFD agreement? Please, Mr. Steele.
Thank you very much, Excellencies and dear participants. Thank you very much also for the invitation. I would want to outline 4 elements in terms of private sector key priorities that I have experienced in within my time in the private sector and investing, in particular also in developing countries. And I'll then outline 2 additional elements regarding fostering sustainable investment in industry sectors and in countries. So firstly, regarding private sector key priorities, I would like to emphasize that any measure should have a long-term perspective. Short-term financial incentives such as subsidies can be the icing on the cake or the last push over the finishing line for investments. However, long-term investors such as companies as Bosch and many others are looking for an attractive investment framework that is predictable and stable in the long run. Anything, for example, if we wanted to build a plant and it's something that we don't know whether the investment framework would not change over the next 10 years, significantly would be a significant impediment. Secondly, Key to us is also that the measures are transparent for the whole industry or specific industry sector in order to ensure a level playing field for competitive companies. Suspicion or speculation about back office deals would be counterproductive, and we've also seen that in certain countries. Thirdly, host countries should also make sure that companies can bring in the right experts, also from abroad, if and when needed, as well as in a fast and unbureaucratic way. In most cases, companies only bring in foreign experts I see that in particular, being responsible for Africa, that there's a very often quite a high hurdle either to bring in experts in time and very fast that we would need to also keep our business running and profitable in country on the continent, as well as train the right experts, for example, in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Fourthly, single touch points, as for example, we've experienced with the automotive industry in Morocco, should be established with the backing of the highest government office in the country. For example, the one of the president or the prime minister. The reason for that is that often a variety of ministries or areas are relevant for investments. If there's a ministry of investment, there could be a ministry of housing or building, infrastructure, finance, economy, etc. Experience shows that potential investors can get conflicting information from various host country parties and authorities, causing significant delay or even abandonment of investment. So a coordinating force in the highest office in the country, in our experience, have helped a lot in expediting investments or even facilitating them altogether. In that regard, I would also would like to highlight that in some instances, it might also be relevant to have a single touch point created by host and home country. This, I think, can be seen right now very much with the emerging hydrogen economy, and I'd be very happy to expand on that further in the Q&A session, where both home and host countries could be interested in a successful investment. For company or industry sector, it would be easier to navigate and achieve a win-win-win scenario for the company and the countries if there's an in-principle agreement between the countries, including avoidance of red tape in both countries as well as in between the countries. So let me just mention two more elements regarding sustainable investment, as that had also been mentioned already earlier. Here, I would like to firstly mention that in order to foster sustainability in investments, specific incentives could focus on areas of sustainability, such as a respect for the environment, whether it's CO2, whether it's pollution or others. However, we believe that such measures should be structured as additional incentives and not as sanctions. In particular, in developing countries where the investment environment can be very challenging, potential sanctions may backfire and discourage investment altogether. Punishment or negative incentivation has often not worked in our experience. One should rather consider positive incentivation, for example, additional subsidies for appropriate measures. But also in emerging markets, one needs to consider such incentivation in a multidimensional space, optimizing macroeconomical affordability, microeconomical and ecological considerations, and not only focus on one element of the UN sustainability goals. In any event, incentives should be technology neutral to foster the best solution. Such investors could be singled out in a special category as recognized sustainable investor or similar. And such investors could then receive preferential treatment, such as shorter time frames for approvals, a green channel for imports or exports, or red carpet treatment for aftercare. And I could give quite a few examples to that in the Q&A session. Secondly, and lastly, and then I'll also stop my intervention, host countries should also work in tandem with home countries to create a pipeline of such projects, for example, in the hydrogen economy, promoted through a platform that helps connect capital to investment opportunities. And there's a lot of green funding around right now. And investment promotion agencies should cooperate on two-way FDI flows, as mentioned earlier, with regard to the hydrogen economy. Ideally, that should be on a multilateral basis, because two-way agreements on a single country basis could be implemented. And if they would be implemented, potential investors would be lost in the jungle. In particular, if we talk now, for example, from a regional to region collaboration, I'm very much involved right now with the European Green Deal in Africa. And if we need to go through that jungle of 27 member states on the EU side, and more than 50 member states on the AU side, I can only tell you already from a tax perspective, that is an absolute nightmare. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Thank you for your presentation. I think your views from the investor's perspective is very helpful for the ongoing discussions in the WTO on investment facilitation. Thank you. Now, let's move to our last speaker, Mr. Aaron James. Good early evening, James. I know now in your country it's just the 4 o'clock a.m. Please, Mr. James, could you share your country's views and experiences on how the IFD agreement can reinforce domestic and regional initiatives on investment facilitation in practice? Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct pleasure for me to be here today to represent the government of Grenada to participate in this important conversation. I will just outline how I will proceed. I will just give a brief background of our involvement in the negotiation, and then I will go forward in terms of answering the question posed by Mr. Moderator. So, as you may be aware, Grenada has been an active participant in the investment facilitation negotiations. Just a few weeks ago, we submitted joint proposals with Dominica on home state obligations, special and differential treatment, and technical assistance and capacity building. We are participating in these important negotiations since reforms to the domestic regulatory environment underpinned by an international legal architecture have the potential to complement and expedite domestic reform efforts, strengthen our regulatory, legal, and infrastructural framework to benefit more fully from inward investments, which align favorably with our national priorities for sustainable development. And at a broader level, the proposed reforms can catalyze us to galvanize the involvement of multiple ministries and agencies, as well as the private sector, to undertake national investment facilitation reform measures in a coherent manner. Of course, when we joined these negotiations in November 2019, we had no idea at the time that mere weeks down the road, a global health pandemic would emerge and throw the world off its axis. In this regard, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed many of the areas in which we are deficient. On the flip side, the pandemic has also cemented the need to accelerate reforms to boost economic growth and development and build resilience, including with respect to investment facilitation reforms. FDI and investment more broadly support jobs, introduce new technology and know-how, and play an important role in furthering our integration into the global economy. Some of Grenada's priority areas for inward investment include agribusiness, information technology and communication, education, energy, health and wellness, and tourism. Let me go to the World Bank's Doing Business report of 2020, where Grenada has an overall ranking of 146 out of 190 economies. Notwithstanding this overall ranking, as a sign of the positive impact of some of our domestic reform efforts, in certain key areas, such as starting a business, we are performing considerably better than our peers in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, gaps remain in some areas, and it is the government's priority to close these gaps, especially as we focus on the post-COVID economic growth and development. Encouraging investments, both local and foreign, and improving the overall doing business landscape will be a key part of our economic recovery efforts. In the context of the emerging WTO disciplines on investment facilitation, we are in the process of preparing to undertake needs assessment and gap analysis to determine first, how we measure up, and second, what support we may need from our development partners to expedite our investment facilitation reform agenda. I choose the word expedite out of recognition that post-COVID recovery would require bold and swift, though not reckless, action to boost economies. In addition to the COVID-19, you will all be aware that Grenada, like many of the small island developing states, faces the almost daily reality of exposure to climate change, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation. Therefore, we also have to focus broadly on building resilience to external shocks, whether those that present themselves in the form of a global public health pandemic, a global economic recession, or natural disasters over which we have no control. This takes me to another fundamental point, which is that our aim in undertaking reforms is not an end in itself. Rather, these reforms must go a far way in contributing to the sustainable development of our economy. Sustainability can come across as a buzzword at times. However, we also see considerable potential in attracting sustainable investment as part of our efforts to build economic resilience immediately post-COVID and beyond. Therefore, we see the emerging agreement as a way of signaling to the world that Grenada is open to the sustainable investment, and we are prepared to upgrade our facilitation measures and mechanism to enhance the flow of these types of investment into our jurisdiction. Considering all of this, for small states such as ours in particular, there are opportunities from investment measures which can help foster sustainable development and attract other development in terms of helping us to develop our investment portfolio. Ultimately, these efforts should deliver real and lasting benefits to our people and our environment. Finally, Mr. Moderator, a major priority for us in the negotiations is to secure a high standard outcome on special and differential treatment and technical assistance and capacity building to ensure that there is a substantive development enhancing dimension in the final agreement. Reforms, though beneficial, also require substantial human and financial resources, and a favorable outcome would be securing some of these resources through our participation in this process to unlock and expedite our ongoing reforms. I thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dew. Thanks to all the panelists for sharing the insightful and thought-provoking views and ideas. Now, let's move to the question from the audience. I have one question on the table for the Ambassador Frank. What elements should be included in the agreement on investment facilitation for development for developing and the least developed country members to drive the most benefits from it? Ambassador.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned in my introduction on the minister gave very clear indications in 2017 and 2019 of what was needed to have a better climate for facilitating investment and increasing the flows of foreign direct investment into developing countries and LDCs. The group has been working on that based on proposals from developing countries as well as developed countries. So the agreement has now very important provisions regarding some elements, and also the ambassador of LAPE and the representative of Grenada mentioned, in order to better prepare developing countries to attract investment, and particularly investment of quality and in a sustainable way. There are many other measures that have been discussed, but I think that they will need to have further conversation among the group. So that's why the group also decided, or is inclined to have a work program agreed together with the final agreement. And also important for developing countries is implementation. I think that it's how developing countries are going to implement this. How long will it take? What will be the needs, specific needs in terms of implementation? And that's why provisions on special differential treatment in Annex 5 are really key important. I have to mention also an interesting point, that many developing countries, including LDCs, have implemented many of these measures, or are in the process of implementing this measure. I mean, as Ambassador LAPE just mentioned, So they realize and they recognize the need in order to improve the investment environment, in order to compete and attract quality investment. So that also has to be taken into mind, and their experience has been very important to shaping up the provisions in the agreement.
Thank you. I know that Ambassador Kamani also would like to make some views.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I could not agree more with Frank, Ambassador Frank, on these questions raised. I also support the Marcus Thiel investors' perspective in terms of the home and host countries, communication, coordination, cooperation. That's why the LAPE have submitted very specific proposal on these Southeast Tech to establish supplier development programs and domestic supplier databases. We believe that through this establishment, we can have three at least benefits out of this establishment. First, to increase the capacity of domestic suppliers to contract with foreign investors, and would be a key complementary effort to the establishment of the local supplier databases by helping to increase the number of local firms that are linkage ready. And second benefit, that to allow foreign affiliates to source locally. And thirdly, to strengthen the domestic enterprises sector, the bedrock of sustainable economic development. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Sorry. Thank you, Ambassador. Now there's a question for Mark Steele. Mr. Mark Steele, could you elaborate on the idea of having both home and host countries creating single points or other mechanisms to help investors? Steele?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And I think there can be quite a few mechanisms. If there's a standing commission, for example, between the EU and Africa, and if we are now talking about the hydrogen economy, and a coordinating function, but there is very many business summits which are at the sidelines of government summits, whether it's the China-Africa summit, it's a Russia-Africa summit, there's an India-Africa summit, and I can believe that can be done with many or other of these, in particular, developing countries, that on the sidelines of G20 summits, etc., there could be an institution which could be organized by, for example, the EU Commission and the AU Commission, or whatever government body that would be involved, that could then coordinate and facilitate and be present at these business summits, so that one can also, with a public-private engagement, actually outline what is required to, and giving again the hydrogen economy as an example. In northern hemisphere countries want the renewable energy created green hydrogen from Latin America or Africa. On the other hand, in my point of view, needs to be a significant advantage for Africa or for Latin America in terms of job creation and know-how transfer, etc., etc. And with these engagements alongside summits, political summits with the business and a standing commission that could be established between the world regions. This type of mechanism, I think, I'm completely convinced, could add huge amount of value to FDI flow in all directions.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for your views. Now, I think due to the time constraint, we have last question. This question for James. I think all of us know that there's a multilateral agreement on trade facilitation. So, James, would you share some views? Would the approach of the IFD agreement to special and differential treatment be similar to that of the TFA, Trade Facilitation Agreement? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for this question. As the chairperson of our National Trade Facilitation Committee, I see this linkage or this idea of having similar texts and similar measures be implemented in the IFD. Because, for example, if you have the needs assessment was conducted during the negotiation of the trade facilitation agreement. And this was very helpful in terms of ensuring countries can designate their category or self-designate, which was very helpful in terms of getting technical and other assistance from development partners. So a similar text in the IFDA in terms of categorization, just like the A, B, and C under the TFE, will be very helpful for developing countries, especially Grenada, so that we can self-designate and also seek technical and other capacity building initiative. Also, one other thing from the TFA that is very good is that committee. And once there's a local committee established in the IFD, this will be very helpful in terms of ensuring that whatever measures are there are implemented in a timely and efficient manner. So this is our contribution here from Grenada. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, James. Now, additional last question for our coordinator on IFD. Ambassador Frank said that around 100 WTO members are participating in the negotiations. The question is, why more countries should join? How they would benefit from the agreement on investment facilitation for development in the WTO? 2 minutes for the answers. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's an important question, and I think I can handle it in 2 minutes. This is a multilateral organization, as you well know. The joint statement and declaration in 2017 clearly highlight the importance that the outcome of this process or this discussion should be multilateral. Currently, we only have 105 members. Not only, we have 105 members, so that's almost two-thirds of the membership. But to be truly multilateral, we would like to have all WTO members on board. Why? I mean, first of all, because the organization is based on rules that apply to everybody, rules that are predictable, transparent, fair, and non-discriminatory. So leaving members outside may create some distortion. Certainly, the kind of measure that members are envisaging in the agreement will probably apply de facto to all WTO members or to any country. So, but we also, and as we heard from the presentation, particularly from the representative of Bosch, know that the private sector is looking for transparent, clear, streamlined procedures and rules on a long-term basis from every country where investors want to invest. So that's why we invite, and we're trying to do our most effort to convince other members to be participants on this process. And finally, this process was based, and I should have said that before, was the discussions now we're negotiating disciplines, but this comes from a long process of discussion of practices, of experience of members, just as Lao mentioned, and Grenada and many other developing countries in LDC, their experience on this kind of measure, the needs of this kind of measure, and what have they been doing. So this is not something that it will be, there will be some issues about implementation, but this comes from experience from developing countries. So it's nothing that will be so difficult for them to implement. And if there's a need and the difficulties, there will be special provision on that. 2 minutes?
Thank you very much. Once again, let me thank all the panelists for the excellent presentations and for the discussion. Despite the different backgrounds and the perspective of the panelists, I think we all recognize the value added that the IFTA agreement would bring to the WTO members and its crucial role in promoting sustainable development for post-COVID recovery and building resilience. Under the unusual circumstances caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to look for effective collective responses to global challenges. The IFTA initiative started as a pro-multilateral framework, and we hope that many more WTO members will join the initiative. In this regard, I sincerely hope all WTO members, especially developing and least developed country members, could join and play an active and constructive part in the IFTA initiative. With only 2 months left before MC12, I would like to take this opportunity to encourage all IFTA participants to be open-minded, pragmatic, and constructive in the discussions in the run-up to MC12. It's time for us to develop a tangible outcome with a proper balance between ambition and policy space, which could serve a cornerstone to conclude the negotiations and seek a multilateral solution in the near future. To conclude, let me underline again that the continued commitment, engagement, and close cooperation of all parties in the IFTA initiative will be crucial to revive global investments and promote a rapid, resilient, and inclusive economic recovery from the pandemic. With the joint efforts, I hope we can all benefit from it soon. I thank you again for all your engagement and look forward to discussing further with all of you in the future. Thank the professional technical support from the secretarial team. Thank you all.